If you're jogging, you're not exercising. You're performing a locomotor activity. You might be exercising, but you're exercising very, very poorly. Yeah, it's a mess. If you want to get really picky about the semantics, I would just call it exercise. But again, sticking with high intensity training because that's what people have been calling this specific approach for quite a while.
Welcome to Corporate Warrior, the podcast that brings you the best advice on how to improve your health, optimize performance, and maximize productivity. With your host, Lawrence Neal.
This podcast is brought to you by HitUni.com. HitUni.com are a provider of amazing online courses for high-intensity training qualifications. HitUni comes highly recommended by the best in the field, including Body by Science co-author Dr. Doug McGuff, Discover Strength CEO Luke Carlson, and trainer and founder of Baye.com, Drew Baye. It was founded by my friend, author, and longtime personal trainer Simon Shawcross, who's also been a guest on the podcast. Simon has 15 years experience training clients and has supervised over 15,000 high-intensity training workouts. Using knowledge from experts like Skylar Tanner, Dr. James Steele, Dr. Ellington Darden, HitUni is a goldmine for learning everything to do with high-intensity training. The courses are delivered online through the website, where you can learn via a variety of multimedia materials at your own pace. There's online support and a discussion forum where you can share ideas and ask for help. To learn more about high-intensity training and improve my own results, I started their personal trainer course. The content is amazing, the courses are really easy to follow, and each section is organized into bite-sized chunks that give you a real sense of achievement after you complete each one. I should also mention there is a DIY course. So this is the course for you if you're not necessarily a personal trainer, but you want to learn more about high intensity training and how to implement it for maximum benefit in your own exercise regime. To get your exclusive Corporate Warrior 10% discount on any course you purchase, simply head on over to hituni.com, that's HITUNI.com, and enter the coupon code CW10, that's CW and the number 10. So again, head on over to hituni.com, pick your course, and enter the coupon code CW10 for 10% discount. Thank you for your support. Hey guys, I am Lawrence Neal, and welcome to another episode of Corporate Warrior, the podcast that teaches you how to optimize your health, exercise, business, and lifestyle. My former guests include paleo pioneers Mark Sisson and Rob Wolf, zero-carb carnivores Dr. Sean Baker, high-intensity strength training experts like Dr. Doug McGuff and Drew Baye, successful entrepreneurs like David Allen and Noah Kagan, and many, many more. If you are new to high-intensity strength training, and perhaps you've just read Body by Science and are keen to start training right away and also learn all you can about high-intensity training, you will absolutely love this episode. In this edition, I am joined by a veteran high-intensity trainer, Drew Baye. Drew has the #1 high-intensity training blog on the internet, which is a HIT treasure trove and one of my favorite destinations for all things exercise-related. As I said, this is a real beginner episode, and we cover what is high-intensity training. How do you construct workouts? How do you perform exercises correctly? How do you measure progress over the long term? And much, much more. For all of the show notes and links for this episode and all episodes, please go to corporatewarrior.org. Don't forget to hang around the end of this episode for your free gift from me. And now I give you Drew Baye on high-intensity training for beginners. Drew, welcome back to Corporate Warrior. Appreciate you coming back on the show.
Oh, glad to be here.
Cool. And so the purpose of this episode is really to provide the beginners to high intensity training a real kind of foundation of what is HIIT, why should they do it, and perhaps some tips on how to construct workouts and manage things like volume and frequency if we get that far. But it's really just to keep it quite basic for people who are really just maybe they've read Body by Science or one of your books or started reading about it online. They just want to learn a little bit more. So can we start off by talking about, what is high intensity training?
Well, this is an area where there is a lot of confusion because in the industry, you've got people using the term to mean all sorts of different things. On the surface, if you say high intensity training, it could refer to anything that is done with a high intensity of effort, because the term training is actually pretty vague. Training is a lot broader than exercise. And the reason that we call what we do high-intensity training is just because Ellington Darden actually used that term back at a presentation at Duke University in the, let's say, early 1970s. Nautilus was there. Arthur Jones was speaking about the Nautilus training principles. And apparently Arthur got... as typical Arthur, started insulting the intelligence of a lot of the exercise physiologists in the audience, and they managed to come up with an excuse to get Arthur off the stage for a little bit, asked Ellington to go on and talk to him, and Elle went up there and presented these Nautilus training principles and talked about how one of the most important was that you train with a high intensity of effort, and referred to this whole thing as high-intensity training. But what it really is, what we're teaching is actually just evidence-based exercise. The only reason I even stick with the label high-intensity training is because there are still some people that associate this particular philosophy with that. But ultimately, if you were to look at what the evidence says about how we should exercise, it all points to training with a high intensity of effort being one of the most important factors. What distinguishes this from other philosophies about how to strength train and exercise in general is that the emphasis starts with that intensity of effort, and then everything follows from that. How much exercise you should do, how often you should do it, whether anything else is even necessary. A lot of other people would define exercise in a very vague, very general way as being any physical activity that is performed in a way that is more demanding than the body is accustomed to for the sake of improving fitness, which is just worthless as a definition because it doesn't really define, it doesn't delimit. When you say it that way, somebody could say, oh, well, running is exercise, or swimming is exercise, or playing sports, or mountain climbing, or gardening. None of these things are exercise, though. Exercise is not anything that you do that is physical and demanding. What is the goal of exercise? It is to stimulate improvements in the general factors of functional ability. It's to improve physical functional ability, health, and appearance. Those things are your muscular strength, local muscular endurance, your cardiovascular and metabolic efficiency, your bone and connective tissue strength, your flexibility, and your body composition. Now, if we look at what is required to do this and to do it efficiently and safely, it comes down to muscular loading. So exercise is about efficient muscular loading. And when you look at what the requirements are of efficient muscular loading, you realize that it's necessary to design movements around the function of the muscles and the joints that they act on that load those muscles, that work them intensely, because that's a requirement for stimulating these improvements. And the more and more you look at what is required, the more it limits it. And ultimately, if you're looking at what is exercise, it comes down to progressive resistance training. And even that's redundant, because if you're exercising, the basis for exercise is that intense muscular work, which depends on the resistance. Resistance exercise is somewhat of a redundant term. But high intensity training, really, that's redundant too, because if you're exercising properly, it's going to be high intensity. If the intensity isn't high, then it's not exercise. You might be practicing the performance of an exercise, or you might be doing some different activity, but exercise is, by definition, intense. If it's not demanding, it's not exercise. So it's actually a really poor term, and it's just stuck around more for tradition than anything else. I would actually dump it if I could, but at this point, it would be And it's like a big oil tanker, really, really hard to turn one of those things once they get some momentum in a particular direction. Yeah. Actually, I don't like the term. It should just be exercise. This is exercise. Everything else is not.
Yeah,
or
I completely
it's
agree.
wrong exercise. You're doing high intensity training, or what we are calling high intensity training. You're exercising. Everything else is either exercising wrong or not exercising. If you're jogging, you're not exercising. You're performing a locomotor activity. If you're doing some kind of crazy this functional training, so-called functional training nonsense where you're doing exercises while standing on one leg on a wobble board, you might be exercising, but you're exercising very, very poorly, incredibly stupidly. So, yeah, it's a mess. If you want to get really picky about the semantics, I would just call it exercise. But again, sticking with high intensity training because that's what people have been calling this specific approach for quite a while.
That's it. It's relatable, right? And it kind of. Well, people will see, you talk about, for instance, Drew, you blog about high intensity training, or I have a podcast that talks about high intensity training. It's more specific, even though you're quite right. It's just evidence-based exercise. And it's so funny because I say to people all the time, and I'm sure you get this all the time. They'll say, you have a podcast. What's it about? And I say, high intensity training. They're like, yeah, I do that. I'm like, no, you don't.
No, most people don't. And even most of the people who think they do don't.
Yeah. And obviously, like pretty much 100% of the time I say, what is it you do? And they'll say, something similar to like P90X or Insanity or fill in the blank. And I will say, well, actually the type of high intensity training I talk about on the podcast is this. It's resistance training. So, et cetera, et cetera. Sorry, yeah, go on.
Since you bring that up, those activities are another part of the reason that I really actually dislike the term high intensity training, because if you look at some of these programs like P90X, CrossFit, some of this just stupid, awful stuff, it might be very poor programming, and it is almost always just horrible style of exercise performance. But technically, they are working at a high intensity of effort. They're just exercising very poorly. So technically, those things, if it's strength training performed with a high intensity of effort, could still be high intensity training. But that doesn't make it proper exercise, because there's more to it than that. You could say that all exercise is high intensity training, but not all high intensity training is proper exercise. Basically, if you are exercising, you are performing, and again, I hate to even use resistance exercise. The whole reason for using these kind of terms is to differentiate it for all of the other people who don't know any better and are confused. But you've got to speak with the ignorance of the majority of people in mind when using this terminology. But if you're talking about proper exercise, if you are considering, what the evidence shows, as well as just common sense with regards to the idea that exercise should be about getting the maximum physical benefit relative to both risk and time investment over time, then this is exercise. Exercise is ultimately what, Darden called high intensity training. But a lot of the other things that people are doing that they call high intensity training, whether it's, some sort of resistance training or some sort of, sprint interval training or whatnot, not all of that stuff is exercise. Yeah, it gets confusing. A lot of times it's not even worth it trying to explain to people or even bring up the name high intensity training. It's like Skylar had mentioned, I think, in his last talk with you about the marketing. He doesn't even tell people that he does high intensity training. Just this is how we exercise.
Yeah.
So yeah, it might seem like just a semantics issue, but it is important.
It is
understanding that.
Problems. Yeah. okay, so that's kind of talking a little bit about, the terminology, where it comes from and why it can be quite confusing for people. So the people listening to this, their chances are they understand the type of high intensity training we're talking about, the type of strength training. So do you want to talk about, a little bit more detail in what a typical protocol looks like and why one should do it?
Okay. First, since the word gets thrown around a lot, and a lot of people don't seem to quite understand what it is, protocol specifically in the context of exercise, we're talking about how the exercises are performed. I've heard a lot of people use it for all sorts of things, including programming and other stuff. But in terms of protocol, the actual exercise performance, there's a lot of different protocols, specific ways of performing the exercise that could be considered, correct depending on who you're training and what they're trying to get out of it. You've got general categories like dynamic exercise and isometric exercise. Then you've got different ways of doing those in terms of the range of motion or the position, whether it's continuous or intermittent. What I usually recommend as a protocol for people starting out is very similar to Ken Hutchins' super slow protocol. Dynamic repetitions over the full effective range of motion, which means the full range of motion over which the muscles that are being targeted encounter meaningful resistance, which may not be the full joint range of motion in some exercises. And they should do this at a very slow speed. People should move as slowly as they can smoothly. And starting out, I'll typically have people go, while they're still learning, around 90 seconds or so before I will stop them. And then over time, as the resistance increases and they start hitting momentary muscle failure, I'll start adjusting the resistance so they're hitting that between about 60 and 90 seconds. And then from there, I'll adjust it based on any patterns I see in their charts with where they might be typically hitting momentary muscle failure. But pretty straightforward, very slow speed of movement, as slow as they can go without the movement becoming segmented, a series of short starts and stops. And starting out, I usually stop people if they get to around 90 seconds. I don't start people out training to failure. When they begin, their focus shouldn't be on how hard they're training. It should be on learning to do everything correctly so that as they gradually build up to a higher level of intensity, they get the form down so that they're less likely to break form once they start training hard. If you throw somebody into a really hard workout right off the bat without teaching them to do it correctly, their form is going to be garbage. And once they've established that, it gets a lot harder to correct.
Right. Okay. Sorry, you're going to say?
Oh, no, yeah, so typically very slow speed of movement, slow as they can go smoothly. Start them out with a weight that they're not going to hit failure at too early on. I just want people to focus on learning to do the exercises correctly. And more than just how they're moving during the exercises, also all of the other safety considerations, proper breathing, keeping their head and neck still, keeping their face relaxed, avoiding gripping where the grip is not needed for the exercise, not moving around, not grabbing the affected muscle part, lots of other little details that I want them to have down. And when they've got these things down, then I'll start pushing them a little bit harder. Once they get to that point where they're consistently able to get to momentary muscle failure, start increasing resistance so they're hitting that between 60 and 90 seconds. After that, I'll watch for where the individual tends to reach momentary muscle failure, and I might adjust their target time under load range to that.
What might a basic workout look like?
Well, depending on the person, and really quick, before we go any further on any of this stuff, it needs to be understood that anything that we would talk about would be no more than a starting point. There are general principles which apply equally to everybody, but the best application of those principles is going to depend on the individual, their physical condition and capabilities, what they're trying to get out of their workouts, and other circumstances affecting their ability to work out, their body's ability to recover and adapt to it. So I don't want anybody to take anything that I say here and say, well, that's the workout that you're supposed to do, or this is exactly how you're supposed to do this or that. It all depends on the individual. That being said, and again, all of this assumes that there's no injuries or physical conditions or equipment limitations or anything. Starting out, I recommend that most people do only a few exercises. A single compound movement for the hip and thigh muscles, a single compound pulling movement, and a single compound pushing movement. After a few workouts, they should gradually start adding in one or two more at a time until they're doing, maybe, again, depending on the equipment available, depending on the person, I usually have them build up to about 10 exercises. A compound pushing movement with the lower body, a trunk extension movement, a combined hip and back extension, a pushing and pulling movement in both vertical and horizontal planes. And then we usually round that out with direct exercises for the calves, the abdominal muscles, and the neck flexors and extensors. Now, part of the reason for starting out with just a handful of exercises and gradually adding is because if you teach this stuff properly and you really pay attention to all the details, there is a lot to it. From a practical standpoint, if you're trying to teach more than 2 or 3 exercises in a session, then you're glossing over a whole lot of stuff. It takes, if you really want to go into detail and really want people to understand this stuff, it takes a while to cover all of the important points. And then every time after that, you need to make sure that you're reviewing and reinforcing until these things are second nature, until they're ingrained and people have them down. So, for example, they might just do leg press and pull down, or maybe leg press, pull down, and chest press on the first workout. Following workout might add in a compound row and a shoulder press. And then a few workouts later, maybe back extension. And then a few workouts after that, maybe abs, eventually calves, eventually after that, neck flexion and extension. And a lot of people would get really impatient with the process, but a lot of people also grossly underestimate how much goes into learning how to do these things perfectly. A big part of the problem, both with people who exercise and people who teach exercise, is that there's assumption that these movements are relatively simple, that a barbell curl, for example, is just you holding the barbell and flexing your elbows and then letting it extend, where there is a whole lot more to it than that. And if you want to have people just pick up weights and put them down, that's fine. You can teach it that way. But if you want people to exercise in the most effective and the safest manner possible, then you want to treat these exercises the way that you would any kind of high-level athletic skill. Golf is a good example. There are people who will pay absurd sums of money and spend an enormous amount of time trying to perfect their golf swing. But a lot of those same people couldn't be bothered to put a fraction of that effort into learning how to perform a leg press or a pull down or any other exercise as well. But it should be treated that way. When you're doing the exercise, you want to strive for mastery of it. And if you think about what is the benefit of this and what is the potential risks of doing it wrong or poorly in the long term, you appreciate that it is more than worth the effort. Problem, and another reason that you really need to focus on this, is that for most movements, for most skills, mastery takes a large amount of practice. But because as exercise becomes more intense, you need to be careful not to do too much of it to avoid overtraining. You can't do too much practice. So you have to make sure that every time you do get the opportunity to do that, that you do it as well as possible. But again, most people, they get in a machine or they pick up a barbell and they're just thinking about moving the weight up and down. And even if they are thinking about their form, a lot of times they don't understand, much less put nearly the amount of concentration and effort into doing it correctly as they ought to. So again, to do these things right and to make sure that people learn it, they've got it down before you give them anything else, you want to start with just a few and gradually add it in. Now, there's a couple other reasons for doing this. If you have somebody do a full body workout and something bothers their shoulder or their hip or their knee or whatever, their neck, who knows, and the next time they come back to you and they said, you know what, after the last workout, I was feeling this. Well, if you had them do every single exercise in there that you have planned for them at once, it makes it, I mean, you can, depending on where they're feeling it, you can narrow it down, but you're not going to be able to do that as well as if you only have them do a few. If you have them do 3 exercises and after a few workouts, there's no problems, and then after you add in another exercise, a couple more workouts, there's no problems, and then you add in a 5th exercise, and the next time they come back and you say, you know what, after that last workout, I felt something in my neck, you may have an indication that, okay, there's something that needs to be changed about the way this particular person performs the exercise. Maybe we have to substitute a different exercise for this, depending on what you see when you have them do that again. Sometimes people aren't injured by the exercises, but they may have physical conditions or just structural abnormalities that are revealed when they start doing the exercises. So you want to be careful when introducing new exercises to do so a few at a time. Kind of like if you were going to prescribe drugs. If you give somebody about 5 different things and have them start taking them all at once, and then they have a side effect, it's a little bit harder to determine what caused what than if you introduce them a few at a time. And part of it is also the conditioning. I mentioned earlier, you don't start people out training very intensely. You start them out with a weight that they're not even going to fail on in about 90 seconds or so. You want to have them learn to do the movements correctly and gradually make it harder. But at the same time, you're also trying to build up their conditioning. You don't want to throw them into a workout where they're going to be sucking wind and getting dizzy and all that all at once. And again, this also, like I mentioned earlier, it depends on the individual. Some people you can push a little bit harder, a little bit earlier. But for a lot of people, you want to gradually build up so you can see how they're responding in terms of their recovery, and also so that you can gauge what they are able to handle without being so wiped out by the end of the workout that they're not able to give as much effort to those last couple exercises. So there's a lot of different reasons for doing this, but I don't like to throw an entire workout at somebody right off the bat. Start them with a few exercises, go over them in detail, reinforce that every time, gradually add exercises to their workouts, and very gradually build them up. In fact, one of the things that people are, I talk about how intense this is all supposed to be when I start people out, and they're usually surprised. Well, that wasn't terribly hard. And I say, well, we're not trying to make it hard. Right now is learning. You've got to learn to do it right so that later when you do it hard, your form doesn't fall apart.
What does doing it right look like? I mean, I know you've already talked a little bit about exercise form, but can you just elaborate on that in terms of how one should execute an exercise with kind of, the master level execution that you alluded to?
I'm going to give some very general descriptions here because obviously the specifics will vary from exercise to exercise. But first, exercise doesn't start when you're picking up the weight. The process begins when you're entering the machine, or when you're positioning yourself under the bar, or when you're picking up the bar or the dumbbells, or even with the body weight exercise when you're getting into position. And this is something that deserves a lot more attention than it gets. There is a right way to get into a leg press machine, and there's a whole bunch of wrong ways. There's a right way to enter a seated row, and a whole bunch of wrong ways. There are a bunch of right ways to do a bunch of things and a whole bunch of wrong ways depending on the individual in some cases. So you have to give as much thought and consideration to how you enter and exit a machine, how you load and unload from a barbell, whether you're getting under it, picking it up, etc. If you're doing an exercise with dumbbells and you're handing it to somebody or they're handing it to you, how you do that matters. All of these things. So it starts before you even begin moving the weight. You have to think about entry, and then once you are in a machine or once you've picked up the bar or the dumbbells or loaded underneath it, you want to make sure that you have proper body position and that you set yourself, so to speak. When you do an exercise, if you push or pull against something, that pushes or pulls back against you. When you are standing while holding a barbell, there's going to be certain effects on your ability to maintain your balance. And you have to contract certain muscles to be able to maintain your correct body position as you go through the exercise. You want to get those set tight before you start moving the weight. Then, when you start the exercise, you don't want to suddenly make the weight move. You barely attempt to contract against it, and then you very gradually increase your force until you feel that weight start moving. And then you slowly, strictly begin to accelerate that up to a very slow speed. This whole process should be very controlled. You never just pick the weight up and start pushing or pulling it. For example, on a leg press, once, and I'm not going to go over the whole thing about getting in position and all that, but once you are in a leg press and you are properly positioned, your feet are where they need to be, you are set in the seat, you don't just push and move the pedal or push the seat back. You barely apply effort. You think about just compressing the socks between your heels and the soles of your shoes. And then you gradually increase the intensity of that contraction until the weight just barely begins to move. Somebody watching should have a difficult time telling at what point that weight starts moving. Once it does start moving, again, you want a very controlled acceleration. And then once you get it going, you move just fast as you can without the movement becoming stuttered. Series of short starts and stops. And now as you're doing this, as you're moving, you don't think about making the machine move. You don't think about making the bar or the dumbbells, or if you're doing a body weight exercise, whatever portion of your body you're lifting. You don't think about that going up and down. You focus on contracting the muscles that you are attempting to target with the exercise and producing the desired body movement. The machine, the barbell, the dumbbells, or whatever, just go along for the ride. Now, Ken Hutchins is the one that I got that particular terminology from. What I like to tell people is when you're doing an exercise, it's not about you doing something to the weights with your muscles. It's about you doing something to the muscles with the weight. And when I actually discussed that with Ken, we talked about it a while back. It's just a different way of a real short way of explaining his concept of the real versus the assumed objective of exercise. He was talking about the idea of when you're doing the exercise, you think about the contraction and not the weight. And I like that phrase. The weight just goes along for the ride, but got to make sure that he gets credit for that. So once it starts moving, though, it should be a very smooth, very controlled movement. As you approach the end point, which is the end of the positive. I hate the bottom and the top. People are the bottom, the top. I use this sometimes because it's easier than stop and explain things. But when you're doing a squat, the bottom is the start. The top is the end point. But people start at the top and then they end at the bottom when they begin that first negative. So it becomes confusing when you're talking about some of these exercises if you're not clear about it. When we're talking about the end point, we're talking about the end of the positive. Start point, the beginning of the positive, just for clarification. So as you approach the end point, you don't suddenly come to a stop. You anticipate the end of your range of motion and you gradually slow to a stop so that as soon as you get there, if you're doing a compound pulling movement or a simple movement, you are able to stop without bobbling, without any, movement out of proper positioning, and then you hold there, or after you're in for a few repetitions, you maybe do a squeeze. If it's a compound pushing movement, as soon as you get there, you immediately but slowly reverse. You don't hang out there. You watch a lot of people when they do leg press or squat or chest or shoulder press, any of that, they get to that end and then they will sit there for a moment before they start letting the weight down. Think of it as a point that you pass through on the way from the positive to the negative instead of going just back and forth. Of course, you are just lifting and then performing the exact movement in reverse for the negative. But if you think about it as a point that you pass through, you're going to be able to reverse direction a little bit more smoothly. Now, this is also important. Something that drives me nuts when I see it is the entire time that you're doing this, your face is relaxed. You're breathing in a relaxed manner. You might be breathing heavily, but your jaw is just hanging off of your skull. Your mouth is open. The air is going in and out. Your hands are relaxed if you're not pulling something. Now, if you're going to do a compound row, if you're going to do a deadlift, a chin-up, you have to grip intensely. You have to hold on to the handles or the bar securely. But if you're doing a leg press, your hands should be out of the way and doing nothing. If there's handles on the side of the seat, your hands should be resting on them. Your thumbs should be with your fingers, not wrapped around the handle, because it reduces the inclination to grip. And your hands should just be resting there. They should be dead, just sitting. You shouldn't be gripping intensely and squeezing and pulling. The hands should not be doing anything. And you definitely shouldn't be grabbing at your legs while you're doing the leg press or grabbing at any body part during any exercise. When I see videos, though, I see these people saying they're training intensely and they're doing all this. Their heads are, head and neck stabilization too. Your head should not move during the exercise unless you're doing a dynamic exercise for the neck. You should be looking straight ahead. Your chin should be slightly down. You shouldn't be forcefully extending your neck. You shouldn't be tucking your chin real hard. You shouldn't be whipping your head around. But I see people doing exercises and they are making these faces and they're yelling and they're grunting and all this other stuff. And they think that it's an expression of effort. They think that this means that the person is training really hard, but they're not. It has nothing to do with it. People do that nonsense all the time that aren't training hard. It makes it look, it's theater. It's exercise theater. They are making a show of working real hard, but it actually is completely separate from what is happening. If you have good self-discipline and control, you can get through a brutally intense exercise without grimacing or gritting your teeth or yelling or grunting or any of that stuff. All of those things distract from rather than contribute to what you should be doing. The only thing that stuff does is it indicates to other people that you are acting like you're working hard. Anybody who knows better is going to see that and roll their eyes and think, just cut it out. Do the exercise, drop the histrionics. This isn't drama class. But other people may see that and go, oh, he's working hard. He's yelling, he's growling and grunting and all this stuff. Now, somebody asked me once, what does momentary muscle failure look like? And I say, it doesn't look any different than the first rep if you are using good form. When you approach momentary muscle failure, none of this should change. The only thing that happens is as you fatigue, your muscles are not going to be able to contract at the same pace. You're actually going to go even slower. There may be some shaking depending on the individual. But you still don't grimace. You don't start moving your head around. You don't start making all sorts of noises. The only noise that you want to hear from somebody when they are doing an exercise is just that heavy breathing through an open mouth. If you hear somebody and all this stuff, stop them, make them set down the weight, and start over. Every time they do something like that, if they hold their breath, if they start grunting or making noises, if they start moving their head around, you stop them, you make them start over. If they refuse to follow your instructions, you fire them as a client because you don't want them to blame you if something happens to them when it's their fault for not following the directions that you are giving them. But that's what it should look like. From start to finish, when you're doing an exercise, it should look smooth and controlled. You should appear, from your face and everything other than the breathing, relaxed. If it's obvious to somebody else that, if you're making noises, moving your head around, making faces and all that, that doesn't mean you're training intensely. In fact, again, it's a distraction from it. But so it drives me nuts because I see so many people in high intensity training pay lip service to good form. And I'm sure that they think it's good form. We obviously have very, very different standards. But most of it's just awful compared to what it can and should be. Good form in exercise looks more like Tai Chi than boxing. Very slow, deliberate, controlled movement, not fast, sudden, jerky movements. And it's a very different experience when you learn to do this correctly as well.
Do you know what? I just had some videos done of some bodyweight high intensity training movements exercises, and I was gonna send one to you the other day, Drew, but I got a bit nervous because I was like, he's gonna judge me on my form. but I think it would be valuable.
Well, you can't look at somebody's form without judging it, one way or another. I've actually, as a policy, I no longer comment on any other HIIT trainers' videos. Because I just don't, two things. One, I just don't want to get into it because they're all great people who are doing the best they can and they mean well. Even a lot of trainers who have absolutely no idea what they're doing, they're in it because they want to help people. And that's awesome. And I am glad that they're out there doing it and at least doing it somewhat correctly if they're promoting high intensity training. The other reason is as soon as I get into a form issue, then I end up getting a million questions, and that's stuff that I'd be better, served by answering those in a format like this, or in a book or a course or something, than spending time on Facebook or Instagram or wherever having this discussion. But it's frustrating because you see all this stuff and they're talking about, look at this person's form. It's so good. And you just look at it and you cringe. And you're like, no. But yeah, I don't want to get into a half an hour discussion every time I see a shitty video of somebody doing an exercise because I would never get anything else done.
Yeah. And no, I actually invite it because I think my form's quite good, but I would actually be really happy to see what you would say and if you think I can make any improvements. So it will be on the internet soon, so you'll be able to see it and comment if you so wish. And I invite that if you decide to. So that's awesome. So we talked about what is high intensity training, why should we do it, how to construct workouts, how to execute exercises effectively, and I suppose this you've been talking about it from the perspective of a trainer, but one can listen to this and also understand how they can train themselves if that's all they can do because they don't have access to a good trainer or what have you. But can you talk a little bit more about how one should measure performance from workout to workout, how to do that effectively and progress?
Yeah. First off, the most important thing that anybody should measure is their goal-specific measurements. or the goal, the things that are specific to their goals. For example, if your goal is to improve your body composition, then that is the most important thing for you to measure and to make adjustments based on. If your goal is improvement in a specific athletic event, that has to be, you, depending on what the event is, how you qualify or quantify performance might be different. But you have to keep in mind, people get caught up with the numbers on the paper, on the charts. But what is most important is what the person wants to get out of the workouts. So it's, the workout charts themselves are extremely important, but you have to also have those goal specific measurements. Now, in terms of the workouts themselves, you have to keep track of a bunch of things. And that starts with writing down the exercises that you're doing during the workouts, the order that you're doing them in, and any relevant settings. For example, if you're doing an exercise on a machine, if you use it with different settings each time, if you're just kind of guessing where to put things, or even worse, if you just sit down on it without even paying attention, then the difficulty of the exercise can vary. So everything else is, worthless. You can't really compare, for example, what you're doing on the leg press from one workout to the next if every time you come in, the seat position is different. So people need to pay attention to that. When you use a machine, you write down the specific machine. You don't come in and, I'm going to do leg press first and just do any leg press. You want to make sure that you're using the same machine, or if you do have to use a different machine, you have to write down all the settings so that any time in the future you use that machine, you're comparing based on that. But for every exercise you do, you write down the settings so that when you're looking at performance over time, you're comparing apples to apples. If you're doing an exercise in a power rack, you want to record the position of the hooks and the safety bars so that every time you use that rack, you don't have to go and figure it out again. For example, if you're doing a bench press, and I recommend doing it inside a power rack. Unless you have somebody that is a workout partner or a trainer that you work out with on a consistent basis, don't go into the gym and assume that you can count on any of the people there for a spot for a bunch of reasons. One, you don't know if they're actually strong enough to do it correctly. Two, if they're going to be attentive enough. Three, if they know how to spot. A lot of people, if they're spotting you, as soon as they see just the slightest hint of trouble, they'll grab the bar and start pulling it off of you, which you don't want. A spot should be just enough assistance that you are able to continue the repetition at a slow pace to get the bar back into the hooks. You're better off doing it in a power rack because then you don't have to rely on anybody else. When you do, the safeties should be set high enough that the bar can't touch your neck, but low enough that you're able to bring it down as far as your shoulders can go comfortably before reversing. Not necessarily your chest, because it depends on the individual. It depends on their, limb length. It depends on the thickness of their torso and other factors, but you want to be able to get through your full range of motion without the safeties getting in the way, but you don't want to have that bar able to come down on your neck. Well, it might take a few tries with just the bar to determine exactly where that needs to be. With the bench that you're using, most of them will be at the same height, but you want to be consistent with that as well. You don't want to have to go through that process every single time you go to work out on that. A little bit easier if you're working out at home because you can leave certain things where you need them. But if you're working out in a gym, all of that needs to be recorded so that when you go there, you go to the station, the rack, the machine, or whatever, you know exactly how everything needs to be set up. You don't have to waste time figuring that out again or messing around with it. You can get in, do the exercise. The next thing is you want to record the resistance used, and if you're doing reps, count the number of repetitions. If you're just recording your time, record the time so that every time you work out, you know how much weight you used or the resistance and how much time or repetitions, depending on what you're recording, you were able to complete in good form. If at any time you change the order, you would also want to record that. For example, if you do like the first 3 exercises are leg press, pull down, chest press. And let's say you come into the gym and some idiot is sitting on the leg press, talking on their cell phone, and they don't want to let you work in, but you don't want to assault them right there in the gym. So you do the pull down first, and then you go back to the leg press. Well, you would want to make a note that you did the pull down before the leg press in that workout. If you're using paper charts, I usually just put a little box in the upper right corner of the weight and time box, or the weight and reps box, and write the order in there if it's anything other than the order that the exercises are written in. And then if it's on if you're using a spreadsheet or something like that, then you can just go and put it in parentheses, as long as it's consistent the way that you do it, so you know what it means. But you want to record that, because whenever you're looking at the workouts, if you're comparing them over time, if you're looking at one versus the previous one, anything that you do that changes the order of the workouts is going to also change your ability to perform certain exercises. Every exercise has local and systemic effects that impact your ability to perform all of the subsequent exercises. So if the order changes, you want to be able to look at that in the future and know that that was the case, so that if you're comparing it with another workout, it's like, well, why did I do worse on the pull down on this workout than I did the one before? Well, maybe in the one before you did it first in the exercise, you weren't as fatigued, where normally you perform it a little bit later in the exercise. Of course, you want to keep track of the date so that you know how often you're exercising. Something that I recommend that people also do is keep track of the start and end times of their workout. Part of this is just so that they can compare, over time, the pace that they're able to get through it with. Now, you should always move slowly during exercise, but you should move as quickly as you can safely between exercises. And keeping track of the total workout duration is one way to measure this. Of course, if you're working out in a gym, that's not always under your control, especially if you go during busier hours. Something else that some of my clients keep track of is their average heart rate, peak heart rate, and heart rate recovery after 1 minute, usually 1 minute after the last compound exercise. Once you start doing things like neck and calves, you're not working as much muscle mass. Your heart rate's going to start to go down a little faster than that. So if you want a little bit better idea of heart rate recovery, for example, if you're doing, if your workout, like we talked about earlier as an example, if you're doing leg press, pull down, chest press, row, shoulder press, trunk extension, or a stiff-legged deadlift, basically a big, hip, thigh, and back exercise, all big compound exercises, working a lot of muscle mass. You're going to, if you're doing it intensely and if you're moving quickly between exercises, your heart rate's going to get up pretty high pretty quickly. But if after that, then you go to, the abdominal machine or a weighted crunch, and then calf raise and the neck flexion and extension, no matter how hard you perform these exercises for the muscles you're targeting, it's not as much muscle mass. You're going to not have the same cardiovascular effect. So looking at heart rate recovery, if somebody's interested in tracking that, I would wait for just 1 minute after their last compound exercise to compare the difference, and then go to those simple exercises. Weight. If you're doing any body weight exercises, you should write down your weight on that day. If you're, for example, I do chin-ups instead of pull-downs. So I'll keep track of my weight. So for example, if I'm looking at charts from a few years ago and I'm looking at, well, look how many, chin-ups I did with X amount of weight, and now, I'm 205 pounds instead of 180 something. And well, why am I not using as much weight for the chin-ups? Well, if I didn't keep the track of the body weight, it might look like I'd actually gone down, where that isn't necessarily the case. So if you include any body weight exercises in your workout, you also want to track the weight so that you can compare that over time. And this is absolutely, it's essential for you to be able to evaluate whether or not you are getting stronger. And if you're not, that's an indication that changes need to be made to your workouts. And it amazes me, just baffles me, that there's so many people that go to the gym that aren't keeping track of anything they do. Very rarely will you see somebody that has a notebook or a clipboard, and even now, there are apps for this sort of thing, although most of them suck. But you can use a spreadsheet. You can do it on your phone. But you rarely see people keeping track of their workouts, no charts. And it's even worse when trainers do it. I don't go to gyms very often. I absolutely hate them. They're horrible places to work out most of the time for a variety of reasons. I would rather that everybody worked out at home. It would save them a whole lot of headaches. But occasionally, I will meet people at gyms to put them through a workout. I've got a lot of online clients that live in different cities that will occasionally travel to Orlando. And if they usually work out in a gym with machines, then it's better to meet them at a place that has similar machines so that I can go over the stuff that is going to be most relevant to the way that they normally work out, instead of having them come here where I'm training everybody with body weight and free weight equipment. And when I do, I'll usually wait around a little while and just watch the other trainers, watch the people working out, because it is as amusing as it is disheartening to see all the dumb stuff people are doing. And the worst, though, is watching the trainers. And occasionally listening to some of the just idiotic things that they're saying. And again, like I mentioned earlier, most of these people mean well. And I'm sure that they have the best of intentions, but they have absolutely no idea what the hell they're doing. And one of the worst things I see is trainers that are not keeping track of what their clients are doing. There's no charts. There's no documentation of performance. They'll do all these silly, often worthless assessments with people. I've seen all sorts of goofy stuff there, and I'm sure that periodically doing that gives them some numbers to give people. But without actually keeping track on their exercises on a workout-to-workout basis, they are doing people a huge disservice, because you need that information to be able to adjust the volume and the frequency of your workouts, as well as, in some cases, order of exercises and other things based on how individuals are responding. And real quick aside, since I mentioned it, a lot of people will ask about, well, what assessments do you do starting out? Very rarely are any required, unless a person has some specific thing that they want to focus on. And the reason for that is that, if people have movement issues, the exercises themselves are the best assessments for most of these things. How does a person move when they're performing these exercises, and how does that improve over time? If you're teaching the exercises correctly, and if you know what to watch for, just having them do the right exercises for their goals is a better form of ongoing assessment than periodically having them do some of these silly movement and balance and posture things that some people recommend. But with the workout charts, most important thing, exercises in the order they're performed, the settings for all the exercises, the resistance used, the reps or the time under load, the order if it's changed, the date, and your body weight if you are doing any body weight exercises. Additionally, you could do start and end time, average, peak, heart rate, and heart rate recovery. 1 minute should be enough for that. And then you should also have a space for notes, where if anything unusual happens or if there's any other circumstances that might affect the workout, you could put it down there. For example, if your workouts normally take you about 23, 24 minutes to get through, and you got to the gym at a busy time and some idiot was sitting on again, this is the typical idiot sitting on a machine with their cell phone, not letting you work in. And let's say your workout took, a couple more minutes that time. If you don't write that down, guy sitting on the, had to wait longer between these two exercises, then later on you might look back at that and say, well, why, I went up on all these exercises and then it was down a little bit the next workout. What happened? Well, the reason that you went up maybe a few more seconds in that particular one compared to the next is you had a lot more rest before going on to them. So anything like that. Or if you're, maybe, you're doing something different with your sleep, and let's say suddenly you see there's an improvement in your workouts when you're looking back at charts from some, period of time, and you don't have any notes. You don't know, well, what happened? What did I do differently there that all of a sudden my progress improved? So it's great to have these to be able to look back on over time and see, what kind of things worked well, what kind of things didn't. And this is like 1995, there was a presentation that Fred Hahn did at one of the Super Slow Exercise Guild conventions. And he said you should treat your exercise program like a lifelong experiment. Ultimately, you know what you're trying to accomplish. You're trying to stimulate improvements in functional ability, physical appearance, and health. But you've got all these variables that are changing. And if you're not keeping track of all those and keeping track of how your body's responding to it, then you're really not getting as good an idea of what works best for you. And so if your goals change over time and then some point in the future you want to try doing something again that you did in the past, you can go back to that if you got the charts and say, well, when I did this, it worked really well for that particular goal for me. You know what to do instead of having to repeat that process if you can't remember exactly what you were doing then. So it's useful to have this. And as a trainer, you'd be an idiot not to keep track of people's workouts, because if you know what you're doing, then people should be making relatively consistent improvement. Maybe not on a workout-to-workout basis if they're an advanced trainee, but if you're tracking their workouts and you're tracking their goal-specific measurements, you've got something to show them to say, okay, here's where you started and here's where you are now. Or something to tell other people about. Somebody comes to you and they say, well, I'm 40 years old, and I've been working out for, since I was a teenager, and I just can't seem to build muscle. What can I expect? You can say, well, I've got so-and-so, so-and-so, so-and-so. I've got all these people, and this is what is typical for muscle gains for somebody your age. Of course, it doesn't mean that that person's going to have that because the genetics and other factors are different, but it gives you an idea of what might be possible. So it's beneficial to have this stuff. You want to, if you're training yourself, you need it to know if you need to make changes in your workouts. If you're training other people, it's absolutely essential.
Yeah, I agree, and it's fascinating how much of a difference such a small change can make. I train my partner, and she didn't do the leg press first, which she normally does. Because she has an injury in her knee. And I think that's actually been down to the poor design of the leg press. It's not very good at all. And I think it's a result of her knee coming too far in towards her during at the end of the eccentric or the start of the eccentric.
It's hard to say without seeing the machine. It can be different things.
Yeah, true. I asked Bill Day Simone about it, and he gave me some views. But anyway, so there's an injury. She had an injury below her knee. I think it was a patella tendon. And so we skipped that machine entirely for the next workout. And we went straight to assisted chins. And I was like, a time under load is significantly better than it was before. And then obviously I quickly realized, we haven't done a leg press. And it's easy to forget how much systemic fatigue a leg press can cause. And how that can impact your performance. And obviously there's tons of other variables which you've already mentioned. Now, just talking about progress, I want to talk about that a little bit more. Would you be able to explore or explain, how one should think about progress over the long term when it comes to training and tracking that?
Oh boy. Well, first off, people should not be obsessing over their progress on a workout to workout basis, because there are a lot of things that can affect exercise performance. What you are recording when you do a workout is not strength. You are recording your performance on the exercises, which is influenced by strength, but it's also influenced by motivation, your rest and nutritional status at the time, and a lot of other factors. So you can't look at a particular workout and then the one following it and say, well, I got this much stronger between this workout and that workout, without considering everything else that may have been different. However, if you look at enough of them over a long enough period of time, you can see trends and tendencies. And so that's the first thing. You have to look at it over a period of time. The other thing that I would caution people against is treating their workouts as a competition, where they're always, one of the things that it just pisses me off when I hear it, people are saying, you should try to beat your previous reps or weight on every workout. You got to constantly be going up, which is just nonsense. And it actually is counterproductive to think about it that way. Your goal during the workout is not to lift as much weight or perform as many repetitions as you can on each exercise. Your goal is to perform each exercise and the workout as well as possible to stimulate your body to improve the different factors of functional ability to get the desired results while minimizing your risk of injury. Now, if you happen to be doing everything else right and you're getting stronger, then that will show in your workout charts over time. But if you are going up in weight, or if you're getting more repetitions or time, it should not be because you're trying to do that. In fact, it should happen in spite of your best effort to achieve momentary muscle failure as efficiently as possible because of a strength increase. When people are just focusing on trying to get reps or trying to move the weight, they will often compromise their form for the sake of doing so. So don't look at your chart and say, well, I got 6 reps, or I got 50 seconds or whatever on this exercise last time, so I've got to beat that. No, you don't have to beat that. You have to perform the exercise as well as you possibly can, and then just record what happens. If you're trying to beat that and your form keeps deteriorating, you're gradually increasing your risk of injury while not really doing anything to improve your results. Seems counterintuitive, but your goal is not to make numbers go up on paper. It is to get stronger and better conditioned. And the best way to get stronger and better conditioned is to perform each exercise in a way that makes it as hard as possible, which is going to make it less likely that you are going to go up in reps or time or weight as quickly. But when you do, it'll mean that it's because you are actually stronger rather than just because you are getting better at cheating the weight up. You want to do these exercises so well that when you get to the end of it, there is absolutely no doubt in your mind that you loaded those muscles as efficiently, you targeted them as well as possible, and that you didn't cheat. You want to make the exercise as hard as possible. Now, if your time is going up, or if you have to add weight, despite the fact that you have done everything that you could to achieve failure as quickly as possible with the weight that you're using, then you can be certain you got stronger. But if you're just trying to do whatever you can to make the weight go up, to get a little bit more time, or to add reps, then if the number goes up, you can't really be sure, was it because you actually got stronger, or did your form get worse? So don't think about your workout chart as your like D&D character sheet. You're not trying to increase your strength stat on paper. You're not trying to make numbers go up. You're trying to stimulate improvements in your body. If you're doing it well, then over time it's going to show on your body, and it's going to show in what you can do and how you feel. The paper, nobody even sees the paper anyways. It doesn't matter for any of those other things. It's just there for you to evaluate how your body is responding so that you know when adjustments need to be made. It's if you're not honest with how you're doing the exercises, and then what comes out on the paper is not going to be as useful. So I really hate it when people say, oh, you just got to always try to get more reps. No, always do your best to use the best possible form on the exercises. Your goal is efficient and safe muscular loading, not a number, not a time, or anything like that. But with that being said, over a longer period of time, you should see improvement. If you're not going up over a period of at least a few weeks, then something is wrong. When you start, you should be going up a little bit faster, partially because when you start out, you should intentionally start easy so you can focus on learning as you gradually increase the intensity. But even eventually, once you get to the point where you've been training for a few years, there should still be improvement. It's going to be a lot slower, but there should still be some improvement. Now, if you've been training for decades, and once you get to your, say, 50s or whatnot, then it's unrealistic to think that you're going to go up in weight or reps every workout, or even every week, or in some cases over several weeks, unless you are a brand new trainee. I've had people who have started exercising, strength training again, so we don't have to explain exercise versus non-exercise, but people who started exercising in their 80s, who had never done anything before, or who hadn't done any kind of physical conditioning activities since World War II. Jesus. And they got stronger. So there is no age that you can't get stronger at if you're just starting out. But if you've been training all of your life, there is a maximum. And most people, if they're doing things correctly, they're going to get most of the way to that within a few years. After that, it's very slow progress. But there should still be some. You should see a pound here, a pound there. Speaking of which, one of the things that I recommend for everybody is getting and using fractional plates so that you can go up in increments of a half a kilogram, a pound or so, instead of having to add 5 kilograms, 10 pounds or so at a time going up on some exercises.
Yeah.
Nobody is getting stronger at a rate where they need to be adding that much beyond the first few months to years of training. Think about it. If you were to add just a pound, say half a kilogram per week, after 1 year, you'd be up, over 25K or over 50 pounds. If you were to keep that pace up, after just a few years of training, people would be able to perform dumbbell lateral raises with 100-pound dumbbells. It doesn't happen. People would be squatting with a ton. It doesn't work that way. The strength does not go up that quickly on an ongoing basis. Eventually, it is going to level off. And the idea behind adding weight is that as you get stronger, you have to increase the resistance so that the muscles are still challenged. Well, the increase should be proportional to the strength gain. Now, you're not gaining strength that quickly, not beyond the first few years, so it's unrealistic to expect that you should be able to add weight that quickly. It makes more sense for most people to do what's come to be known as micro-loading, using these quarter and half pound and 1 pound plates so that they're able to go up just a little bit at a time. So yeah, for longer term progress though, you need to look at your performance on your workouts, and you need to look at these other goal specific measurements over periods of weeks instead of looking at it on a workout to workout basis. The only time that I would even look at people's charts on a workout to workout basis for the sake of evaluation is when they are just starting out.
Yeah, and do you provide the fractional plates? I don't know if you provide that out of your store on your site at all.
Nah, I don't sell them, but there's a few on Amazon that I recommend.
All right,
Unfortunately, they're ridiculously overpriced for what they are, but I don't see that coming down anytime soon.
Okay.
It's worth it though. Actually, I shouldn't say that. It's worth it to have them in the long run. They're a great training tool. Just relative to the cost of steel and what it actually takes to machine those, I think it's a little bit absurd.
Fair enough. Do you also? I use the. I mean, I haven't used barbells in a while, but I use the clip-on collars. I think they're brilliant. Do you know those types of things?
I've seen mention of them. Haven't used them. What I like are the hooks that can be attached to machine weight stacks, where you put the pin through a hole in the hook, and then you can hang fractional plates on the hooks. Except I've been looking for them, and I cannot find them. One of these days, I'll just go to a machinist and have some made. They're handy.
Yeah. Cool. Okay, so that was awesome, Drew. Just really getting into some of the fundamentals here. Let's talk just quickly a little bit about volume and frequency, because we talked about progress and how one should think about that over the short and long term. But obviously, a lot of that is predicated on the volume within each session and then the frequency. So, can you just talk a little bit about how people and especially beginners should go about managing those factors?
Oh boy, this is one of the biggest things that people get bad advice on and get wrong. And that's inside and outside of high intensity training. If you are training intensely, if you are putting a lot of stress on your body, then your body needs time to recover from that before it is capable of producing the adaptations that are stimulated during the workout. The workout itself does not directly cause any improvements in your body. It's just a stimulus. It's a stress. Your body responds to that by producing the desired adaptations. If you do too much, too often, your body can be overwhelmed by the amount of stress and end up having to devote all of its energy and resources just to recovering from that, or not all of it, but so much of it to recovering from that it does not have as much left. It's not as capable of producing the desired adaptations. You need to train very, very intensely to stimulate your body to produce the improvements, but if you have to be very careful about the amount of exercise that you do. And the most that I would recommend that most people do is a full body workout 3 times a week on non-consecutive days. And if you are not getting good results doing that, then you might try not doing more, but adding an extra day of rest between your workouts. So you're giving your body a little bit more time to recover and adapt. Now, I only recommend doing 1 set per exercise, because if you do that set correctly, it is as much as you need. But it is important to understand that by doing the set correctly, I am talking about going to the point where you are no longer physically capable of continuing the exercise in good form. And I'm also talking about doing it, moving slowly enough that it's going to take you probably about 60 to 90 seconds, or maybe less than that. Again, it varies. I usually start people at 60 to 90, but I'll adjust it based on the individual. It's going to take you a while to get to that point. Now, one of the biggest problems with almost all of the discussion of exercise volume is that people define it incorrectly. Exercise is stress on the muscles. That stress on the muscles is largely due to the tension in the muscles over time. Exercise volume is about the effort that your muscles are exerting and the amount of time over which they exert them, not the number of times you make a weight go up and down. For example, if I were to tell you that somebody performed 3 sets of 10 repetitions, that doesn't tell you how much exercise the person did. It tells you how much mechanical work the person did, assuming you also know what the displacement and the weight was. But depending on how long they take to perform each one of those repetitions and a lot of other factors, that could be very, very demanding, or it could be not demanding at all. A lot of people, when they're told, oh, you just need 1 set, they're skeptical because they're thinking of doing it a particular way that is not nearly as challenging as it ought to be. And if you look at most people, they throw the weight up and they practically drop it, or if they do lower it under control, it's for a relatively short duration. And their 3 sets of 10 does not last as long as a single slower set. You know, if you're using again a slower cadence and aiming for 60 to 90 seconds, the time that you're exerting yourself might be longer cumulatively than most people's even 4 or 5 sets. So part of the problem, I think if you were to time the sets in a lot of these studies, and if you were to actually compare this type of approach, this protocol, you would find that the actual volume of exercise is not that much different. This is just a lot more time efficient. If anything, it's more demanding because the work to rest ratio is much, much higher. You're doing as much exercise in about 25 to 30 minutes as most people spend an hour to an hour and a half in the gym to complete, because they're distributing it differently. Shorter sets done more, but with all this rest in between. So I actually, if you look at it in terms of the effort over time, there is probably less difference between a proper high-intensity training workout and what a lot of people think of as a so-called high-volume workout. The problem is when somebody does a set the way they normally do it and they cut back to 1 instead of doing the set correctly, and they say, oh, well, this doesn't work. Well, no, just you're doing the sets really shitty. You have to do it right for it to be able to work. So getting off topic a little bit there, but when we're talking about exercise volume, not talking about the number of sets and reps. I'm talking about the amount of time over which the targeted muscles are working and how hard they're working. So again, the most that I recommend people work out 3 days per week, non-consecutive days, getting at least a day of rest in between, doing 1 properly performed set per exercise. 1, maybe 2 sets, or not sets, but 1, maybe 2 exercises for each of the major muscle groups, and then at least 1 exercise for all the smaller muscle groups. And this doesn't all have to be in the same workout. You can divide some of this up over a couple of workouts. But again, then if they're not getting the results that they want, doing more is typically not going to get them better results. Instead, it's usually an indication that their body needs a little bit more time to recover and adapt in between. Now, problem though, and this goes back to what I was talking about earlier with the claim that you should see the weight or the reps going up on every workout. There are some people in high intensity training who have recommended once a week as a starting point, or who recommend even less frequency, claiming that if you're not going up in weight or reps every time that you're training, that you must be overtraining, which is nonsense. I accidentally hit something there. you're not going to keep going up at that rate once you have been training for a while. It becomes unrealistic. And I think what has happened with some people is they maybe read some of these books and they go once a week or once every 10 to 14 days or whatever. And they think, well, I haven't been making progress. I need to do that. And then their results end up being even worse. Because the problem may not have been that they weren't progressing. The problem was that they had an unrealistic expectation of how quickly they should be able to continue to increase their muscular strength and size as an advanced trainee. So it goes both ways. You don't want to do too much. Too much is going to be counterproductive. But you also want to be careful not to do too little. Now, there are some people who require a lot of recovery time between exercises. But that's not the average. Unless somebody is not getting enough sleep and they're overstressed and they're eating horribly, they should be able to recover quickly enough that if they're working out on their own, they should be able to train 2 or 3 times a week. People who are working with a trainer that knows what they're doing are going to train a lot more intensely. And most of those people are probably going to be better off just training twice a week. There's a big difference. Most people who self-train are fooling themselves if they think they're training anywhere near as intensely as they can and should be on a consistent basis. But people who are training with a trainer, and of course the trainer should be the one dictating their frequency, and if they know better, they'll cut it back when it needs to be. But most of those people probably wouldn't benefit from training any more than twice a week beyond that beginner stage when they're just learning to do the exercises.
Yeah, that's awesome advice. Drew, this has been wicked, and you've covered, I think, a lot of the fundamentals of high intensity training. There is more, but unfortunately we're going to have to wrap up. I know you could probably talk a lot more for another sort of hour or so.
We could talk the rest of the night.
Yeah, but no, it's this has been really good because I think you've done a really good job of just covering the fundamentals, and I'm glad that we got into volume and frequency at the end. And there was a lot of things you said, and even though I've been training this way for a fairly long period of time, there's still a lot of things I can improve on. And there are a few things you said which really resonated with me and made me think about things slightly differently. So I'll definitely be reviewing this. But what's the best way for people to find out more about you?
The best way is for them to visit my website, which is baye.com.
Baye.com, best blog on high intensity training on the internet.
Well, I hope so. If not, I need to step up my game.
I think it is. And for all of the show notes, resources, links that Drew and I have mentioned on this episode, and for the same for all episodes, please go to corporatewarrior.org. And until next time, guys, thank you very much for listening. I hope you enjoyed that episode. Before you head off, head on over to corpwarrior.com. That's CORP warrior.com to get your free high-intensity training Google Progress chart and ebook with 6 interview transcripts of some of my top guests, including Dr. Doug McGuff, Drew Baye, and Bill Simone on how to optimize muscle gain, fat loss, and overall health in an efficient, effective, and sustainable way. These transcripts are deliberately not verbatim. Instead, they've been transcribed in an easy read format to make it more enjoyable and easier for you to quickly pick out what you need and start getting results. To get your ebook, head on over to corpwarrior.com, enter your email address, then check your email for an email from me with a confirmation link. Once you click the link, you will be instantly redirected to a PDF version of the transcripts. This podcast is brought to you by hituni.com. Hituni.com are a provider of amazing online courses for high-intensity training qualifications. HitUni comes highly recommended by the best in the field, including Body by Science co-author Dr. Doug McGuff, Discover Strength CEO Luke Carlson, and trainer and founder of Baye.com, Drew Baye.
It was founded by my friend, author, and longtime personal trainer Simon Shawcross, who's also been a guest on the podcast. Simon has 15 years experience training clients and has supervised over 15,000 high-intensity training workouts. Using knowledge from experts like Skylar Tanner, Dr. James Steele, Dr. Ellington Darden, Hit Uni is a goldmine for learning everything to do with high-intensity training. The courses are delivered online through the website, where you can learn via a variety of multimedia materials at your own pace. There's online support and a discussion forum where you can share ideas and ask for help. To learn more about high-intensity training and improve my own results, I started their personal trainer course. The content is amazing, the courses are really easy to follow, and each section is organized into bite-sized chunks that give you a real sense of achievement after you complete each one. I should also mention there is a DIY course, so this is the course for you if you're not necessarily a personal trainer, but you want to learn more about high-intensity training and how to implement it for maximum benefit in your own exercise regime. To get your exclusive Corporate Warrior 10% discount on any course you purchase, simply head on over to hituni.com, that's hituni.com, and enter the coupon code CW10, that's CW and the number 10. So again, head on over to hituni.com, pick your course, and enter the coupon code CW10 for 10% discount. Thank you for your support.